Hello everyone, this is Chromý and together we will continue the course Interdisciplinary Approaches to Language and its Use too. In this presentation we will continue our discussion of variationist sociolinguistics and we will focus on the social network analysis as a way how to understand language variation. By social networks we do not mean various electronic platforms such as Facebook or Twitter. In sociology, social network is a construct which aims to model the links between various members of a certain community. There are two basic approaches to this modeling. First is an ego net analysis. This approach takes a specific individual as a certain unit and models who does he or she come into contact and to what extent. Sometimes the contacts between the contacts are also examined. The second approach is whole network analysis. In this case, there is no central individual, but all individuals in a given social space are included in the network. These two approaches offer us different analytic possibilities, and in variationist sociolinguistics, we can encounter both of them. Every social network has a certain characteristics, and these characteristics can be quantified. A very important property of a social network is its density. This is a simple measure which can be quantified as a number of existing ties between the individuals divided by the number of all possible ties. In other words, the more ties between the individuals in the network, the denser the network is. Another important feature is strength of the ties. Individuals can have very strong ties with each other if they come into frequent and deep contact with each other. But the ties can also be quite weak, such as in case of people who know themselves, greet themselves if they meet each other, but do not really interact much. We may expect that the stronger are the ties, the closer are the individuals and the closer may be their language use. The third feature of a network we mention here is its closeness. A network is closed in case its members have minimum contacts outside the network, and it is open when the members of the network have a lot of ties outside the network. To illustrate these properties, we may take inhabitants of a mountain village in the 18th century as an example. Every member of this community might know each other member, and therefore the network would be dense. Also, the ties would be typically quite strong, and the network would be rather closed because there would be only limited contact outside the network. A completely different network would be a network of the first-year undergraduate students in a certain university. Such network would be rather sparse. The ties would be very mixed considering their strength, and it would be very much open because the first graders would have a lot of contacts outside the network. Now let's turn our attention to the use of social network analysis in the study of language variation. We may ask whether certain characteristics of a social network have something to do with the way how a language is used in this network. Perhaps there are some general tendencies. Leslie Milroy and Matthew Gordon named these advantages of the use of social networks in the study of language variation. First, they claim that social network analysis enables us to analyze and interpret language variation patterns in communities which are not discriminable in terms of any kind of social class index. Social networks are in principle related to local practices, and they reflect the real ties between individual members of the community, which has a potential to shed light on the dynamic of language variation. The third advantage is that the basic unit in the analysis are particular individuals and not more abstract groups. Now let's have a look at a study by Sylvia Dubois and Barbara Horvath, who examined the so-called Cajun English. Cajuns are a French-English bilingual community in Louisiana. Among other variables, the authors focused on the variable the and the, which can be pronounced as voiced or unvoiced dental fricatives, the and the, or dental oral alveolar plosives, de and the. In these plots, we can see interactions between age, gender, and the social network openness. On the left side, there are the results for women. We can see that older women who have few ties outside of the local network use plosive variants much more than women whose network is open. Interestingly, in the middle-aged group, these differences vanish, but we can see them again for the younger women. Dubois and Horvath argue that the younger generation living in the closed network recycles the traditional variants. Completely different pattern of language variation may be seen in the plot on the right, where the results for men are presented. There are no clear differences in the use of the variable based on the network openness. The local variants of the variable are used more by those men whose social network is rather opened, with exception of the old generation. Dubois and Horvath offer a complex explanation of these differences, and we cannot go into detail here. However, the important finding is that the openness of the social network seems to have a different impact on men and women in this community. The authors claim that the network openness in case of men typically means that they work in town, whereas in case of women it means that they leave the village from time to time and they interact with the non-members of the community. The high rate of use of local "the" variant in younger men is probably due to the fact that these men typically work in the travel business and they are therefore motivated to sound more Cajun. If you are interested in more details, you should read the study. For the purposes of this presentation, it is crucial that Dubois and Horvath show how the social networks may play a role in the use of different variables. Importantly, we also see that the interaction between the characteristic of the social networks may interact with more general social variables as age or gender. Now let's turn our attention to the more general findings of the role of social networks in language change. Research on dense and closed networks, such as the one done by Leslie Milroy in Belfast, inform us that such communities are rather resistant towards language change from outside, and they exhibit a high rate of uniformity in linguistic behavior. On the other hand, more open networks are very susceptible to spread of various variants and to language change, which can happen even very quickly. This is also one way how to explain the dialect leveling, which is typical for the modern societies. We may assume that the traditional rural communities where various regional dialects were used were in fact closed and dense networks where the dialect was pretty much stable. But once these networks started to open themselves due to higher mobility, new variants started to spread to this community from neighboring regions, and the locally highly specific variants started to decline. The last question we will ask in this presentation is how does the language change spread to the more closed networks? Leslie and James Milroy discussed this in their study Linguistic Change, Social Network and Speaker Innovation. They present a hypothesis that the people who actually bring the change, who they call innovators, are individuals with many weak ties, who are therefore able to interconnect various rather closed networks. The authors then ascribed an important role to the so-called early adopters, who are the central members of the community who acquire the new variants and who have a strong implicit influence on the linguistic and non-linguistic behavior of the community. Before we will conclude this presentation, I have one reading tip for you, and this is a classic work by Leslie Milroy called Language and Social Networks. In this book, Milroy describes her research on language variation in Belfast, which was the first variationist research using social networks analysis. If you enjoyed the presentations, we would be glad if you would like them on YouTube. That is all from me now. See you next time.